Welcome to week 10 of organic world building. This is our final week and we're getting everything wrapped up and ready to go to finish off our final environment shots. So let's take a look at what we're going to be going over this week to finish up the class. We're going to be going over color grading, or LUTs, also known as lookup tables. We briefly mentioned them in the last class, but this time we're going to show how to actually create one and the practice of using them inside Unreal. We're going to be adding tessellation, showing off a quick and dirty kind of method of tessellation, and then a more robust, complex, and controllable version of tessellation to really add a lot of detail to your scene. We're also going to be adding depth of field and utilizing this through our camera lens. And speaking of camera lenses, we're going to be showing off our work, and we're going to need to do that with setting up some cameras. We're going to be composing our shots using Unreal's camera system so we can eventually render out some really nice high-resolution screenshots. We're then going to go over how to build a portfolio that is best suited for an environment artist that'll help you stand out from the pack and help you achieve your goal of getting a job as an environment artist at a studio. We'll be going over layout sheets and the proper techniques we want to utilize to best show off our work, as well as have all of our information front and center for anyone viewing our work to know who we are. We're going to be understanding how we can choose the best work we want to show. A portfolio is really hampered by the worst work in it, and so choosing the best work possible is a skill set we're going to want to quickly go over and understand some of the concepts of that and why you want to make sure that you are showcasing your best work, even if it means less images. We're then eventually going to go over website tips and the importance of creating a website on ArtStation and why you really want to choose that over even building your own website. But then also some tips on how to benefit your ArtStation and increase the kind of traffic that you'll be able to see on it, and just a few other tips to kind of round out your final portfolio. All right, so that's a lot to go over in our final week, but let's hit it and make some killer environments. Now let's go ahead and look at how we can add a lookup table or a LUT to add to our scene to really kind of change the post effects of the entire scene and do those changes either in just Photoshop instead of Unreal to really quickly get a really nice varied result without having to worry about, spinning a whole bunch of knobs just in Unreal and trying to figure out what those mean. So to do this, we're going to start by wanting to go to the Unreal wiki page where, this is their just normal documentation. You can just go there, just kind of search Unreal lookup tables or color grading, and it's one of the first pages that'll pop up. And it's got a little tutorial and kind of it'll show you how to do the, bare minimum basics of doing a lookup table. Now, if you scroll all the way down, you'll eventually get to this area right here where it says LUT texture example. So you want to just right click and save the link somewhere. We can just save it right here in with all our other textures. It's just a small little texture thing. And then after that, we're just going to jump back into Unreal and then into Photoshop real quick after that. So now that we're back in Unreal, what we want to do is we want to take a screenshot of our level just so we have, something to work with. So let's just, kind of open this up, give us some nice, real estate to work with, and then we can just easily hit Alt, print screen, and it should quickly take a screenshot of whatever your camera is. So we can kind of come in here and go to File, New, and just create a new clipboard, and then just kind of paste that in there. And then we just want to crop out a bunch of this extra garbage that's kind of in there, just so we're just focusing in on our scene. So if we want to figure out what exactly a color lookup table is, it's basically just this small little strip. It's this little thing of color that tells Unreal which colors and which pixels to render everything in the entire scene. When we come in here and we're going to start making edits to this photo to get it to the way we want it to look, it's going to affect these colors that we're going to eventually save it on top of, and Unreal will understand what the changes that are made here on this little texture strip. So to do that, we can easily just come into layer, adjustment layer, and add in some new layer adjustments and start really kind of changing around the look and feeling of our scene. So we can maybe come in here into the curves, This is always a great one, and we can kind of choose which kind of channels we want to affect. Let's break this out just so we have a little bit more room to work with. And so we can start just kind of coming in here and changing the curves in our scene to try and get a cool effect for our environment that we want. You know, just adjusting things every now and then. So then we come into like the green channel. You know, maybe we want a bit more, you know, red in there, but then pump up the green here. Kind of tone it down again up in the sky. Come into the blue, you know, just adjust some of those, you know, just a little bit over blue that was going on in there. But then, you know, kind of these mid-tone areas, you know, we could increase, as well as the sky and the highlights maybe. So we just want to keep making these adjustment layers, and you'll see, you know, you can toggle them on and off. And this is a great way to kind of just come into your environment and really get that look that you're going for. You can also, of course, decrease the kind of opacity on any of these. So if you're like, all right, that's cool, but you know, maybe it was just a little intense, you can do that. So we'll just want to kind of come in here, again, go to layer, adjustment layer, maybe increase the color balance in here. You know, maybe we can get a bit more red in there, and maybe just increase the green as well. This is very similar to kind of the curves layer, and you know, just kind of pop up a bunch of these different kind of colors to get any kind of mood that we're going for. Now, this is great if you're using any kind of visual reference for, like, say, a film or a, you know, different kind of style guide. You have something in mind that you're trying to copy, or you're trying to create it yourself just by adjusting these. You know, I'll spend a lot of time in here trying to get a simple or, you know, very complex look that I want to have for my scene just by going here and adjusting these. So I don't have to worry about kind of doing it in Unreal and doing it in Unreal's kind of post-processing volume. So of course we can kind of like increase the brightness here, maybe the contrast a bit. You know, just get things to pop a little bit more. And you just kind of want to come in here, play around, find what kind of works out for you and your scene. Maybe increasing the vibrance so you get a little bit more vibrancy. Maybe decreasing the saturation a bit, you know, just so it feels a little bit more old-timey. And then so if you just take all of these and just kind of add them to a group, just call this LUT1, we can just see the kind of effect that it's entirely changed our scene. And we have this totally different look, you know, it's got a more warm, old-timey vibe to it that kind of like fits these kind of teepees and this kind of, you know, older nature feeling to it. Whereas this, you know, it's a nice scene, but you know, it feels like it just needs a bit more pop and a bit more emphasis on some of the aspects of the scene. So once we have all our adjustments and our adjustment layers, then all we have to do is just drag them over to our little color lookup table right here and place them on top. Now what happens is Unreal is going to register, okay, without the lookup table, these are what the colors should look like, and with this lookup table, this is kind of how every single color possible is going to be adjusted. Now that we have everything ready, we just want to save this out into our location for our textures. The one thing you're going to want to make sure you're going to do is, instead of saving it as a target, you want to save it as a PNG. And then just name it something like texture LUT old-timey photo B. And that should work pretty well. And you want to make sure you have no compression on at all. Otherwise, it will kind of crush these down and ruin the effect. So we'll jump back into Unreal, and we'll just want to kind of create a new LUT folder for our texture and import our texture. So you go find it, find the PNG, import it, and then you want to open it up. You want to change the compression type, the level of detail type from texture group. You want to select no bitmaps, and then you want to change the texture group and set that to LUT right down here at color lookup table. So we'll save that, and then you'll see it kind of like fixes all those really little kind of skewed it was having when it was just on the normal default. So we'll just save that, and then we can come down to our post-processing volume, make sure it's the correct one selected, and then we'll go expand this out a bit more so we can see it, turn on the color grading, turn on the color lookup table, and we're gonna select our texture and import it. And as you can see, we now have that exact same effect on our entire environment in just this post-processing volume. As you can see, once you leave the box, it leaves. But we now have it on our scene without having to go through all of the kind of post-processing, different little things to spin around, changing all the color temperature, changing all the contrast, all the settings, any of those things. They're kind of done in our lookup table. And it's a really great way to quickly and efficiently just change a lot of different settings and try a lot of different things. And of course, you can just kind of adjust the color grading here. That is essentially either removing or, bringing back your color lookup table. It can only go to 1, but you can turn it off here at 1, and of course bring it back just to kind of get the feel of what it is and how it's affecting your scene. And this can give a great sense of an artistic element that is missing from a lot of scenes. You don't have to go very heavy-handed with it. You go very subtle. Maybe you just want like a little bit of 0.5 in there, and that way if we turn off the color lookup table, we can see the kind of effect we have at even just a half amount. So it's a great way to really get this kind of extra ability to really improve your scene and bring it to that next level. One beneficial addition you can add to your shaders and meshes is tessellation. Now, tessellation is the process of adding a bunch of extra geometry to your assets or your terrain to be bumped off by your height map, kind of like what we showed off in the parallax mapping, although this time it's actually displacing the mesh itself to give you a lot of extra depth and even shadow information. However, it is an extremely expensive thing, so it's one of those things I like to leave towards the end, as your computer might not be able to handle it, and it could slow down not only your workflow of going forward, but it's something you just want to add on to the end to just add an extra bit of detail to your scene. It's something that's not used that widely in games, as it is pretty expensive, but there are games that do use it, and they use it to good effect. So let's just take a look at a simple rock shader here. It's a little rubble pile, nothing too crazy. It is basically just our normal roughness and diffuse all plugged in. And we also have our height map, and that's going to be important, as that's what's going to drive our tessellation. So the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to be able to have access to the tessellation multiplier and the world displacement. Now, if you see, they're both grayed out, and that's because you have to just click on your normal material node or just any blank space and scroll all the way down until you get to tessellation. And this is where we can turn it on. We want PN triangles, and then a key thing to make sure you turn on for any static mesh object is you're going to want to click enable crack-free displacement. And what that does is whenever kind of UV shells or even tiling occurs, there'll be a lot of these kind of like little gaps and cracks that will happen on your tessellated mesh. So turning that on will help it kind of alleviate those issues, especially once you have adaptive tessellation turned on, which is enabled by default. And what that is doing is the further away from the camera it is, the less tessellated the object will get. This can cause some issues with the kind of swimming effect that you'll see in some kind of videos of tessellation, where it looks like the actual mesh is kind of like, it looks like it's water where it's moving up and down as the tessellation is kind of fluctuating between a higher tessellated object and a less tessellated object. So that is something to be aware of if you're seeing a lot of kind of swimming where your extra polygons that are being created are actually just kind of moving up and down too much. You can turn off adaptive tessellation and everything, it'll just stay a static million triangles, whatever it's going to be, and it's not going to essentially law it for you. That is extremely expensive, and if you put it on even just a few objects, it could just start tanking your scene. So to start out, we're going to need obviously a tessellation multiplier, and that's as simple enough as just bringing in a constant, plugging it in, and converting it to a parameter. And just call this tessellation multi. And then we can just give it a default value of 0, as if we want to turn off the tessellation effect, we can easily do that. Next, we're going to want to utilize our height map and multiply it by another scalar parameter. You can just hit S again as well to bring up a scalar parameter that's already converted to a parameter. And we'll just call this tessellation height. And this is going to control how high your tessellation is being kind of pushed off your object. And that is, of course, going to be based off our height map. So if we have a 0 set in here, essentially there will be no height displaced at all. It'll just kind of all remain flat at where it is on your mesh. And then if you do increase this number, it'll increase the kind of push off that this mesh will have, where like these shapes will be pushing outwards. Now, to get this to work, we need to multiply this by a vertex world space normal, which is down here in our coordinates, vertex normal world space. And we'll just take this result and multiply our height map by our world space and plug that into world displacement. Make sure it's not into world position offset. And that's essentially all you'll need for the most basic of kind of tessellation. So we can just apply this real quick and then just bring up a instance, and so we can just kind of mess around with it. So here we have our kind of tessellated mesh. Again, with our tessellation multiplier at 0 and our height at 0, we're not going to have any kind of tessellation at all. But once we turn on our multiplier to even something such as 1 and our tessellation height to maybe 10 or 20, just to give it a little bit more pop, you can already see that the mesh is being really displaced from its original shape. And if you come into the wireframe, you can see how much added geometry has been added. So this is just the normal kind of sphere that's being put, everything's still being pushed off the sphere, but we're adding a whole bunch more geometry by tessellating it. This of course becomes extremely expensive, so you do need to be careful with this. Now, tessellation multiplier is basically just going to multiply the amount of tessellation that's already there and give you a smoother result. If you wanted to make like a cool sphere render of any one thing and show it tessellated, this is where it would be fine to kind of increase the tessellation multiplier. But generally for your objects in your scene, increasing this number, if it's on, say, a rock or whatever, or a tree, it's going to get really dense really quickly. We can see that right here. It's just almost like entirely just a wireframe. And this is really expensive, and it's not something you really want to go for. You want to keep it, actually in the range of what would be in a normal game. But for your portfolios and everything, you want to show off your best kind of work, and tessellation is just kind of done quite regularly in any person's portfolio, just kind of showing what could be possible and just the highest degree of quality that you can have. So it's a cool thing just to add. When it comes to creating tessellation for landscapes, we need to approach it in a bit of a different method. And there's a few more things we're going to want to add to our tessellation that we didn't add in just the quick and dirty version that you can just instantly add to a static mesh if you just want to get some fast tessellation in there. For a landscape, we want to have the ability to control where our tessellation is happening instead of just randomly all over the entire object, which is what you get from just our normal tessellation that we showed in the previous example. We want to have the ability to control based off generally the camera position where you are tessellating your mesh. And for the landscape, we want to have the ability to not only tessellate around the camera, but also have the ability to either expand or contract that kind of range. As well as we also want to have the ability to kind of control how our height is being displaced a little bit better than what we had before, which was just plugging in our height map and multiplying it by a number. So To go about doing this, what I suggest everyone does is they create a secondary, smaller little landscape, just kind of somewhere out in, kind of no man's land out here, away from your main scene. If your main scene is like something over here, you will want to create a just really quick and dirty temporary landscape, because it'll allow us to have much faster iteration times to really test out these features. Now, if you were to do it, say, on your main level, every shader would need to recompile for that terrain landscape, and that can take a ton of time. You'll start to notice the more complexity you add to your shaders, the longer it's going to take to kind of process and build those shaders. So if you just create, a quick and easy little landscape that just has like 2 textures tiling on it, you can make sure that your landscape tessellation works without having to wait the long process of checking and kind of error checking on your main landscape. So obviously what I did was I just came in here quickly to the landscape tab, click the manage button, click new landscape, created one, it's 15 by 15, pretty small. Applied just a quick landscape shader that I made that has rock and snow to it, and then just kind of sculpted up just some lumps here, and then painted some of the textures on the ground so I can just see how those are working. And if we open up the shader, we can see how it is a pretty simple landscape shader. It has our diffuse textures, or diffuse and our height map textures here, our roughness textures, our normal maps, and just some of the additions. This rock here has some kind of height contrast just to kind of allow it to have either a deeper, darker kind of like height map in some of these recessed areas and brighter areas in the top. That'll be good if you especially want to kind of get like snow to fall in those crevices more quickly than they would on the tops. The normal map for our rocks is using, again, the same thing we learned in our jagged boulders, just kind of increasing the contrast of the red and green channel to give a bit more pop to our normal map. And all of these are just being plugged into their own height blends. Of course, each one is, the height map is the bottom one that you're plugging things into, the top being either your diffuse or your base color, your roughness, or your normal map. And each one has its own layer blend, and they are all plugged into, your corresponding slots. So that's just the simple basics of what this shader is. Nothing too complex. It's easy to make a bunch of changes, test out if things are working or not, how you want to kind of improve your materials as well. So this is a good way to just kind of go about that if you want to just make quick adjustments or kind of bug check a lot of different shader additions that you're adding. So to create a tessellated kind of landscape material, what we want to do is we want to get the camera position in our scene so we can know, or so the shader knows where the camera is, and so we can use that as the center of our tessellation. So we'll just get a camera position, and it's a camera world space position, and we're also going to need just our world position. And this is our absolute world position. And so we're just going to subtract these two from each other, so we can get exactly where the player is, or the camera, I should say. Now, to turn this into usable data that we can then convert to numbers and multiply, we're going to need to get a vector length under miscellaneous, and we're going to want to plug this into a 3 vector, as we have X, Y, and Z that we're dealing with, and so we need all 3 instead of just 2. Now, to get the fade distance, we're going to divide our results from where our camera is in world space position by a constant. And this will be our fade distance. And we'll just want to set some number. We can just set the default to 1,000. And then we'll plug that in. And we'll want to clamp this value just so we don't go outside of the 0 to 1 space, as that can cause a bunch of results. So we're just going to leave the default clamping at 0 and 1. And then what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to use this information to lerp between either a fully tessellated scene or a no tessellated scene. And so what that will do is it'll give us control to either have an area of high tessellation, which will be close to us, or no tessellation. And we're going to blend between the two of those based on our camera position in world space. And so this will be our alpha for our lerp. So we'll just plug this into the alpha as the camera position is controlling where the blend is going to be taking place. And then we're going to need two more scalar parameters, one for the near tessellation and for our near tessellation, we're going to want to give this a value, just a default of 1, as when you're close to the camera, we want it to be fully tessellated at 1 times the amount of just tessellation, either 0 tessellation or no tessellation. So just having it default to 1 is pretty good. And then our second one will be our far tessellation. And we'll keep this at 0 as we want to make sure that, as our camera is far, or as our tessellation gets further away, it'll essentially reduce down to 0 and we'll have nothing. And so we can quickly just plug this in. Well, actually, sorry, before we do that, we have to actually turn on tessellation. And we'll want to come down here and again go to PN triangles. However, this time we are not going to want to turn on crack-free displacement. We want to leave it off. Now, I don't know why exactly this is. I think it's just a bug in kind of Unreal shader thing. It took me forever to figure out why my tessellation had cracks all over it and why it just wasn't working. And then eventually I accidentally left on crack-free displacement and it started working again. So you might need to toggle between the two of these to see if it actually works or not. For some reason, I could never get it to actually tessellate correctly and have basically no cracks in it with crack-free displacement turned on, which is the exact opposite of what you would think. However, for static meshes and everything, you'll want to have crack-free displacement on, but it seems like maybe there's something under the hood that landscapes are doing that you want to have crack-free displacement turned off. So I've left it off, and then we'll just plug this into our tessellation multiplier. And then we can just quickly click apply and then see if our results work. Now that the shader has compiled, we can quickly check out to see if we are getting any kind of tessellation in our landscape. So to do that, we're just going to want to come up to lit and change this to wireframe. And instantly we can see that we have tessellation working, and as we move the camera closer or farther away, it is indeed tessellating like we want. And you can see as you move the kind of camera around, it is tessellating along wherever your camera is in world space. And if we come to our content browser and just open up our instance, we can quickly just change the fade distance to something like 3000, and it expands further out and we're getting more tessellation on screen. And of course, it's just really nice and tessellated around us, and it basically falls off to nothing further away. And so this is a great way to kind of test out, make sure that you're actually getting some of this tessellation in there before you go in and add a bunch of your height detail. As right now you can see, we're just on a flat plane, and basically all we've done is tessellated our ground. Now the reason I kind of suggest doing it this way and making shaders in, kind of different segmented parts is that if you do create a extremely complex shader and something is wrong, you maybe missed a node, you named something wrong or plugged it into the wrong kind of slot, it's gonna be really difficult to figure out what is going wrong and how to kind of work backwards and figure that out. And so this is just kind of a great way to easily just figure out like, okay, cool, my tessellation is indeed working. It does not seem like there are, any cracks in there, which is good, which exactly what we want. And now you can kind of come in there and we'll add in that height detail that should allow us to kind of bump things off based on our height map. Now we might just want to quickly come in here and comment this out so we have, everything nicely kind of wrapped up in our scene, as adding comments are a great way to just easily keep track of what is going on, especially when dealing with your landscape shader. It's probably going to be really dense, so having these kind of comment boxes will really help you figure out what any of these things are, especially if you take a break for even, maybe a week. Come back to your scene, you're like, what exactly does this do again? So these are just great ways to add in remembering keystones for them, especially for stuff like tessellation. So we can just easily move this away. Now we want to essentially go about creating our height displacement the same way we would normally. So we're going to need a vertex normal, get our vertex normal world space, and we're going to want to multiply it by our height map, which would then plug into our world displacement. However, we don't have easily just one height map that we can grab. If we grab the rock height map, then the snow areas will have the same rock effect from that height map as throughout the entire map. So you can't just plug one height map in here. Now, what we're doing in all these layer blends is we are blending our two height maps together, and we want that result. However, if you try and bring any one of these in and plug them in, and then plug them into your world displacement, it's not going to do anything. And the reason for that is it's not blending the height maps together. It's essentially blending either two normal maps together based off your height information that you're painting, or two diffuse textures based off the height information you're blending. So what we need to do is we need to get two height map textures based off the blend from our height maps and essentially combine all of them. Might seem a little confusing, but basically we want to create another layer blend that is blending our two height maps together based on what our height maps are already blending by when we're painting. So when we're painting down things, we're painting down diffuse textures, and they're being blended by our height maps that we're plugging into these height slots. This time, however, we want to get that same information, get that same blend effect from our height maps, but the result, instead of being diffuse textures that's showing up, will be our height map textures. So we can easily just come in here and duplicate one of these layer blends, as we just want the layer blend itself. Now, we want to plug in our height maps into the jagged stone here for our stone, and then we want to plug in our height map for our snow to the top material. Now, if you have any kind of height map control on some of your height maps, like I do with the jagged rock, it allows me to either get more or less contrast based on my height map, so I can get more snow to fill into these cavities. I don't want to plug that directly into the top layer for jagged rock, as what I want is I want just my base height map, just the standard one, no kind of modifications to it at all. I want that to be plugged into the top layer slot, which is jagged rock. Make sure you grab the red channel, as if you don't, you're going to get errors. This is again why we want to kind of bring in our red channels for any time we're using height map slots. If you don't, then the tessellation just won't affect anything. There won't be any kind of height detail, and you'll be like, why is this not working? If you grab it from the white channel, it won't do anything. So we'll want to grab in our red channel, bring it into our jagged rock slot. Same with the snow. Now, when we're coming to bring in our height map detail, we want to use the same kind of height connection that we use on our diffuse textures into those height map slots. So if you do have anything after the height map node, such as this kind of rock height contrast, now is the time that you're going to want to drag these into the height map slots. So if you don't have anything for like the snow, that's totally fine. You can just drag that in the snow. But on the top layers, we just want the base texture, no modifications, as we're just using that base texture for the kind of tessellation effect. And then for the height blending effect of this all, we want the exact same height blending that we have anywhere else. So if that includes one of these, contrasting power nodes, then you will want to plug that into here. Now we can plug this into our multiply node. But instead of just leaving it there, let's get a bit more control, as we still could just then multiply this by a number as we did before and say height, 20, and that'll displace things by a 20 amount. However, it's again always better to have as much control as possible. So what we can do is we can actually lerp between a few different height values. So if we plug this in to our alpha, we can then set up our height slot again, convert this to a parameter, call this test height, and then we can just leave the default value at 0 and plug it into our B slot, which would then go into our multiply. Now, the reason why we're doing this is when we're creating tessellation, if this is our ground texture or our ground just landscape, one of the issues you're gonna have is if you just leave it at kind of a height of 20 before any kind of linear interpolation data, it's just gonna push the vertices off the ground. They're gonna kind of just all get bumped up, and you'll get this kind of, undulating detail that all gets pushed up, and that can cause issues. If you have assets in the ground, or if your character's walking into the scene, you're gonna have areas where it's essentially being pushed up and into the character itself, and that can be a definite problem. So what we can do is we can take the height data and we can just take a positive value of that height, which would push things up, and a negative value will push things down. So we can get kind of, a much more even result where we're getting some bumps up and some down, which is kind of more of what you would want. So if we come back to Unreal, we can use a 1- node to get the opposite of our tessellation height and just plug that into our linear interpolation. Now this will give us the effect that we see here, where we're getting it being bumped up by the tessellation height and then bumped down due to the 1-. Whatever this number, whatever our height number is going to push it up, and then the opposite of that will push it down. So essentially, if you put in a height of 10, it's still displacing the mesh at a height of 20 because it's doing a positive and a negative. So that's a great way to kind of add in a bunch of extra kind of detail for your scene, so you're not just having things kind of all just being sunken into the ground. Now finally, what we'll want to do is, since we are having our tessellation kind of here in our scene, tessellating, the further you get away from the camera and getting this nice gradient, we want to make sure that we have our height information tessellating objects in the same kind of fashion. We want this nice smooth gradient between things that are fully tessellated and not fully tessellated. Otherwise, at this edge around the tessellation, you're just gonna have a sheer drop off. And we want a more smoother transition. So areas that are kind of in this zone here that are like fading out are not as bumped up. They're not pushed up as high as areas right around the camera. So you'll get this nice clean transition. And to do that, it's fairly simple. All you have to do is just multiply our tessellation height by our camera position here. So we're just using this tessellation node again to get this same nice fall off for our world displacement here. We can then just go ahead and plug this into our world displacement, click apply, and then wait for the shader to compile. Now that our shader is compiled, we can take a look and see the effect in action. So we can see, again, still nothing right now, but as soon as we turn on tessellation height and set it to, let's say, a value of 30, we're getting actual tessellation from our mesh. We're getting these little snow clumps to kind of bump out everywhere, getting some nice kind of undulation. Same with the rock. It's creating a lot of nice little depth in there. And of course, we can easily come in here, paint some of our rocks, and we'll see they're just kind of, nicely tessellating out here, and the snow is just kind of quickly falling away. And of course, if we paint some snow in there, we get some nice snow coverage that is, again, being nicely tessellated, and it's catching that light really well. Again, this is a pretty expensive feature. As you can see, it might slow things down quite a lot, so you will need to be careful and aware of that. You're not going to want to come and turn your near tessellation height too high, otherwise it can get, a bit crazy. But if you want to add a bit more geometry in there and your computer can handle it, it's a great way to add in all this really nice kind of detail that looks, hand sculpted if you have a really nice height map, and just it gives this really nice effect. And of course, as you get closer or further away, you're going to see the details kind of like pop out. And ideally, the situation you can see, if we kind of come into these snowy cliffs right here, we can see them slowly fading away into our mesh instead of having that really harsh transition, because we took our camera position and multiplied it by our tessellation height. This gives us the ability to have a tessellation kind of fall off, where when you get closer to something, it's building up until it gets to the max height, and then the farther you get away, it slowly goes down in terms of the amount that it's being tessellated. There's just a great way to kind of keep those transitions, a little smoother, a little nicer. And of course, with all our parameters, you can, increase the fade distance if you want, depending on what your, kind of computer can handle. And ideally for those final end shots that we're, going to want to render out and make look as best as possible. And adding tessellation in there really helps out. But it is a step you really want to save for the end when you've got everything kind of nailed down and looking great just on its own. As in practice, that's kind of what you're going to be dealing with in any kind of game studio and game situation. Now, one of the final little additions I like to add to this kind of crazy tessellation network is I like to add some control for my height maps here that are being plugged into either the top slots. And this will give me control to either increase the kind of contrast or just the darkness or brightness of my height map textures without having to affect any of the slots it's already being used in. For example, I want to just change the height map that is being used to tessellate things, not the height map that is being used to essentially blend textures together. So whereas our top slot is just the texture that's being used for how far things are tessellated, our bottom one is the one that is controlling, how are these textures blending together. So what you can do is we can take a power node. Again, that's our contrast, and we'll get a scalar parameter and do tess height power, and we'll just set the default to 1, plug it in to our exponent. We'll plug our original height map into our red channel, and then we'll multiply this by another parameter, and we'll do tess height intensity. And we'll plug this into B, set the default value to 1, and then plug this in to A. And then plug this into our top slot, as we just want to affect the height map that is offsetting the tessellation. And before actually we do that, we want to again clamp this value to make sure that we don't have these ranges get outside of the 0 to 1 space. So no matter how bright they get, they'll never get outside of 0 to 1, which could cause some really terrible tessellation issues where your mesh gets skewed up super high because the value has gone outside of the 0 to 1 space. So we'll plug this into our jagged layer rock. And when we apply this, it will now give us the ability to control how deep and how high these kind of tessellated areas are reacting. Are we going to get deeper pits here in the blacks and higher areas raised out in the whites for our jagged rock, or as well as our snow? So we could essentially get these snow peaks to be a lot higher and have these jagged rocks be a lot deeper. And that's for just the power node. The intensity node is going to allow us to control the overall look of our height map once it's all said and done. So if you can see here, we could just quickly change this maybe to a 2. And so we can see already we're getting, a darker height map in here. So these areas will be a lot deeper and these areas will be a lot higher. And the intensity here is how bright do we want this texture? If we set it to something like 0.5, we're no longer gonna have an overall extremely bright texture. It's gonna be a bit darker. So the overall kind of height that these rocks are displaced is gonna be a lot lower. Now, the reason why you want to do that, for some kind of textures, you want them to be closer to the ground. You don't want them raised up as much, so you can have other areas, such as the snow, be raised up higher and give this effect of kind of layering and stacking. And so the reason for that is, of course, if we do come in here and we are painting some snow, we can see that the snow is actually sinking down. It doesn't look like it's really just layering and filling up on top of these rocks. It looks like it's kind of all at the same height. Everything is either, at the top of this rock or the top of this peak, or in the valley of this rock or the valley of this snow peak. So increasing the intensity or decreasing the intensity will allow you to get these rocks to kind of just not pop out as much, which will allow you to have the ability to kind of paint either snow or maybe some moss that looks like it's kind of stacking on top of that. And I can just go over quickly to a section to show that off. So here it's just kind of showing off the feature. I have these rocks also being tessellated, but due to the fact that I gave them a kind of height variation and just scroll down here to our little stone pebbles, the intensity is set to 0.8. So it's no longer as high as, say, the snow that's right next to it, that's blending into it. That gives me the ability to get this snow to look like it's stacking on top of these rocks, as the snow is still at the same default value. So if I come in here and grab the landscape I want to paint on and I start painting in some of this snow, it looks like the snow is kind of just stacking up and layering on top of these rocks. And that just gives a really nice effect when the two are seen together. It looks like, a clump of snow has just kind of stacked up and piled here, whereas these rocks are just not as high. They're still giving some really nice depth and, tessellation look to them. However, they're just not the same height as the snow, which is being popped off, a significant amount more than, just the rocks here. So that's a great way to go about doing that. It just adds in another little extra dimension and a bit more realism. So if you have anything that would maybe layer up and stack and just get this extra kind of height feeling, that's a great way to go about doing it. Once we've gotten our scenes to a fairly good state where we're pretty happy with it and we're ready to move on to finalizing and taking our screenshots, we're going to want to set up some cameras in there so we can actually render out some really nice high quality screenshots. And to do that, it's really simple. All you have to do is just come in here and search for a camera, and then you can just drag and drop a camera right into your scene. And as soon as you do that, you'll see you get this nice little box here in the right hand corner, and that's just going to show you what your view or what your camera view is. So you can pretty much just always have this nice little view and kind of just figure out like, oh, okay, cool, this is what my camera is. And then you can easily move it around in case you still want to move in your normal viewport. Now, if you want to actually see a much bigger screen of what this is, you just have to right click on your camera and click pilot camera. And now we're in the pilot camera mode where you can just kind of drive the camera around, explore your environment, and find the screenshot that you really want. Now, of course, when trying to determine what you want to screenshot, we want to think about composition. We want to compose a nice looking shot. We want to get something, ideally in the foreground, such as these teepees right here, something in the middle ground that kind of helps separate and kind of give a sense of weight to our scene, which could be these trees and this rock here, and then, a nice background item, which is our large kind of cliffs here off in the distance. It gives a nice sense of weight to the image. It has all kind of 3 layers of foreground, midground, and background in our scene. We can also do that with the kind of rule of thirds as well when we're composing our scene. So if we just come back to kind of what our original view was, we originally kind of composed this out so that it kind of fit the rule of thirds. And that is, if you split the image into 3 equal parts with like a line down here 1/3 of the way, a line down here 1/3 of the way, a line down across 1/3 of the way, and another line across 1/3 of the way. You want to find that area where these lines converge and meet and have your focal area in one of those kind of quadrants. So if we can jump into Photoshop real quick, we can take a look at what this really is doing. So we can see here is just a kind of screen capture of our scene. And when we're overlaying rule of thirds dimensions on here, where each section is kind of divided into these equal thirds, we're getting our focal area right here, which is where we want to keep it. We want to try to kind of aim focal point areas in like these sections here, 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 and here. It's just kind of where your eye is generally going to want to find the most interest in your piece. And when we are adding our focal area of our teepees in here, it's drawing a lot more interest and dynamic motion to our scene. We also want to remember and to think about any of the kind of line weight that we have in our scene. We don't want too many lines that kind of flow out of our scene, such as this line right here. It's kind of starting to flow out of our scene. Maybe we want to come back here and actually just highlight this road in a little bit more to get that kind of movement into our scene. We have the same kind of going with these rocks right now. They're actually pointing up towards our focal point, which is a good thing and something we want to try and achieve. The rocks kind of create a nice little dip here, which is again, kind of creating some more motion down towards our focal point. Again, we're just trying to highlight our focal point, draw the eye to it, and just always be invested in what our main focal area is in our scene. Now if we come back, we can just leave this as our camera and then just go ahead and then drop a new camera in the scene. Just exit out of the pilot mode. Maybe come back to this camera, pilot this one, and be like, okay, now we have that shot, this one that is kind of the far-reaching, kind of large-scale environment shot. We have a nice close-up here of our foreground, midground, and our background objects. It's really kind of telling the story of these teepees, but maybe we want something a little bit different. Maybe we want something that's just kind of here tucked away into this forest. We have our little frozen lake here. We can just kind of come in here, try and find a nice little spot for this camera. We can, of course, try and create some nice visual trails where we have this kind of little bit of an opening. We have our lake here. It's our main subject of our scene, but we want to create a nice dense forest. We don't necessarily have a intense focal point area, which although is kind of this lake, it's not your overbearing like, hey, here's a building. So you don't always need, in an organic environment, a main kind of structure, anything to be your centralized focal point. However, if you're going to create an area that is very organic, very nature filled, you do still want to have some kind of visual interest in your scene and create leading lines again pointing at it. So we have this nice little opening. We have all the trees are kind of in this very vertical pattern. It's creating a nice downward angle towards our kind of focal area here. And one of the great things about the cameras is that all of the post-processing settings that we have in our post-processing volumes are also exposed here in just our cameras and can be only affected by our cameras. So say you're like, all right, I like this shot here, but maybe I want it to be a little bit cooler. So you can come in here and you can mess around with all these post-processing shots and effects for just this single shot. And you don't have to worry about like, oh, is it going to be screwing up everything else? And you don't really need to make a new volume as it's just this one camera angle. Another thing to keep in mind is the camera settings themselves. Now, the field of view is going to kind of increase or decrease the amount that you see. So you can get a really nice kind of tight focus shot here. That way you're like, okay, cool, I like this. It's really kind of honed in. It feels like it's a really close up of this area. And then of course you can just widen it out in case, you have a much larger space. You're trying to get in a bit more of these foreground elements of maybe there were some rocks here, or, there's some story elements you want to include in the foreground. So you can easily do that by just kind of messing with the field of view. Now, you of course can turn off constrain aspect ratio, which will either remove or give you back these black little boxes here, these little letterhead boxes. And this is where you control the aspect ratio, which is kind of like being like, okay, I want to just focus in right here on this little screen. Now, this is a great way to kind of visualize maybe what you want and where you want to crop your scene. However, when you are going to be taking a high-res screenshot, it is going to give you a lot of these black letterhead boxes, and those might not be something you want to include. Although it gives it a more cinematic look to things, you might want to keep it very wide open here, so that way when you capture a screenshot, it's going to capture all the information and you're not losing anything with these black boxes. And then you of course can kind of go in Photoshop and crop things where you need to. So although it is really cool and it's a great way to just get a cool cinematic feel for things, you are losing all this information. So just be careful of that, as you might want to allow yourself all the information in your screenshot and then kind of crop after the fact. Now, the final one we want to talk about here is the post-processing blend weight. And much like your post-processing volumes, if you turn this down, you can see that the post-processing we put on the camera is removed for the post-processing that is just there in the normal scene. So this is essentially, again, that kind of blend between, a 0 is going to be what our post-processing volumes or no volumes are, and a full-on effect is just kind of our full camera only post-processing look. Now, we mentioned we wanted to talk about depth of field and how we can add that into just our cameras. So again, much like just adding any kind of our tone mapping, our white balancing, any of our other extra image effects in our post-processing on just the camera, we can do that with depth of field as well. Now, depth of field has kind of three main options to choose from. Bokeh depth of field, which is a really expensive, kind of very intense. It requires a lot of knowledge of cameras to really kind of get a good effect for, but it has a lot of options and it can give you some really strong foreground and background depth of field if you're willing to kind of mess around with those settings. There's also Gaussian, which is kind of like a Gaussian blur filter in Photoshop. Generally, it's the cheapest. However, it was kind of the original first depth of field ever really used by Unreal, and it's not exactly true to real life. And then the last one is circle depth of field, and that's kind of the most common one that's really kind of used today. And it won't create as strong of depth of field as the bokeh depth of field, and certainly not as ridiculous as the Gaussian blur, but it's kind of the best of both worlds. And it's the easiest because really there's kind of 4 parameters that you really would want to kind of use and adjust the settings of. Again, it's not as strong as bokeh, but it is still a really good one. And for environments, you really don't want to be blurring out too much of your scene as you want to show it off, and blurring things out, while they do give a cool kind of effect, can hamper your artistic ability to show off your work as you're just blurring it out. So the things we're going to want to look at are aperture, focal distance, near and far transition range. Now, the best way to kind of look at this and find out where your depth of field is working is to come up here to the show button, go to the visualizer, and go to the depth of field layers. Now, what this does is gives you a blue, black, and green layering on top of your screen, and it's kind of showing you where your depth of field is, in what areas are going to be crystal clear, which is going to be the black, which are going to be your foreground blurring, which is green, and which is your background blurring, which is going to be blue. Now, the aperture here is determining how much light is essentially let into a camera. The higher the number, the more light is being allowed in, and typically that way you're going to have less depth of field. The lower number you set, such as 1, is going to give you a higher depth of field, and things are going to get blurrier. And of course, if we just come back here real quick, we can see things right now are already getting really nicely blurry. It's nothing too crazy and over the top. It's just, your eyes are focused here, and this is starting to get blurry. And of course, if we increase this up to like something like 30, this area is starting to become a lot crisper. So if we come back to our visualizer, we can see here the focal distance, and we move this, it's moving where our kind of focal and max crispness is going to be. Everything's going to then slowly blur off that. We're not going to have any kind of super crazy harsh transitions like you can get with either the bokeh or Gaussian, but you still get a really nice kind of effect. So if we want to set this to, say, maybe right here where this secondary TP is going to be kind of more nice and crisp and in focus, we can just put the focal distance right there. And if you see, you've got these little crosshairs, and it kind of shows a number of how far the distance is right where the D is, and it'll let you know what you would need to put in for your focal distance if you're like, oh, okay, I want my focal distance right here, and that's like 245. Or right here, we can see it's, about 930. So maybe we just set this to 930. And then, this area right here is in, our most crisp focal range. Now, near transition and far transition is going to allow you to either get, a softer fall off here in the foreground, or, just a more steep jump up to that kind of either blur or no blur. And same with the background. It'll allow you to kind of push back where your clarity is and give you a bit more clarity, and so your background doesn't get blurred as much. Now, of course, again, with circle, you're not getting any kind of crazy blurring, but we are getting some nice blurring right here, just in our foreground objects. You can see that these little grass blades are not as, razor sharp and anti-aliasing all over the place. So it's really nice to just get a little bit of a softer effect on some of these objects to put more focal weight onto our midground object here. And of course, if we just turn this off, we can see things get, crisper, a little more anti-aliasing on some of these grass blades, but it's nothing too much, and throwing this in there can just give you some really nice effects. Now, when we're ready to actually take our screenshots, we're going to want to go ahead and push the G key on our keyboard, which will turn into game mode. And that way we can still stay in this state right here without having to click play or anything. But now we're in the game mode, and it turns off all our little boxes, all our little lights, everything like that. It's displaying the screen as exactly like a game would show. Now, next you're going to want to come down to the little drop down box and go to the high resolution screenshot. And then an extra little pop-up box will come up. And what's going to happen is it's going to take everything that's being seen by this camera, essentially in your viewport, and take a screenshot of it. And the screenshot high resolution mode is going to basically multiply whatever the pixels are that are being captured right here, and it's going to multiply them by any given number. Now, you'll want to be careful. It even has a big warning here that higher resolution screenshots are going to, be very intensive on your graphics card, and it could crash. So generally, never go over 3. 2 is probably all you'll ever need, as we're not creating super high-res screenshots for anything like print. We're doing it for our website, and generally you don't want to go over anything that's a native kind of screen resolution, as when you're viewing images on a website, the larger they are, the longer it's going to take to load. And if your images are chugging and kind of processing and loading as someone is trying to view them, they're going to be more apt to kind of skip over them and be like, all right, I'm going to move on to the next screenshot, the next thing, the next portfolio in general, if this person doesn't really know how to upload screenshots that are really built for the web and can be used online. So we'll do something like 2, and then we'll just click hit screenshot, and then you'll see it comes down right here, and it'll tell you where it's saved. We can just click it here and then just drag the file into Photoshop, and then we can just check out how big this image is. So it's 2500 by 1400. So maybe that's a little too small for you, and you're like, oh, I really want this a little bit bigger so that I can kind of shrink the image and get some anti-aliasing kind of fixed up in some of these areas. So of course we can just kind of easily come back here, set this to 3, take another screenshot. It'll open up in the same folder, just bring this in here, check out the image size, and now it's a much bigger screenshot. And that's perfect for something if we want to kind of scale it down to a nicer size that we can then put into our portfolio and create a really nice resume with just that. Now, I mentioned we want to keep these images closer towards an actual full screen resolution, as if we do make them too big, they're going to be too hard to load and definitely too slow. So generally, kind of my philosophy on it has always been never bigger than what your actual screen resolution is on your monitor itself. And mine is like 1920 by 1080. And that's generally a kind of good way to go about doing it. It's going to create it so that if anyone was viewing it in full screen, you know, they would have to get all the 100% pixels, they would have to view the entire monitor to see it, which generally that doesn't even happen. But people do like to save high resolution screenshots so they can zoom in, of course, you know, and see every little pixel. But this is a pretty good size. We can then take this into our kind of layout sheets and then add our borders and our names and everything like that on top of it, and then save it out and save it for the web. And we'll just have some really nice high resolution screenshots. Now that we have all our screenshots for just our main scene and our main environment, one extra thing I like to add is kind of a screenshot of the majority of the assets I used to create the environment. I feel this gives off a good example of showing all the assets that went into building the scene, and it gives viewers an understanding and a little nice breakdown of how you went about building it. It also gives potential employers the ability to see your use of modularity and how well you can utilize some assets to create a very large scene. So when rendering this out, there's a few ways to do it. So I like to just create kind of this very simple plane that has kind of a curve in it, just to give some kind of a bit of a shadow and a bit of a transition. So you have this kind of back plane and this bottom plane for your assets to kind of just rest on, and to be just a simple flat color that's, you know, obviously simple shader, something like a 0.8 or a 0.7 kind of gray color is a really nice background to have. You could also use a sphere and just invert the normals so they're all pointing inwards, and that way, you know, anytime you look around, instead of this black background, you'd have a shader that you could apply your material to. The issue with this is it won't allow any kind of cast shadows on the ground. Now, you might want to not have cast shadows on the ground and just to have the assets kind of floating in the air, but I generally like to kind of, if possible, have a little bit of cast shadows, as it can kind of connect my assets to the ground and just gives them a bit more weight. For the lighting setup, it's fairly simple. It's just a standard 3-point lighting. I have my main light out here, which is, you know, of course, just my key light, and it's got an intensity 5. It's got a bit of a yellow color to it. Nothing too crazy, as I want these all to read in their kind of very neutral, natural form. I have my backlight here with a tinge of blue and a much lower intensity. It's just so that the backs of objects don't just get completely washed out. You can just kind of fiddle around with this to kind of find the settings that work best for you. And then, of course, I have my key light, which is just going to add a little bit of highlights underneath these objects, so any of these like overhangs don't get kind of blown out in darkness either. It's set to an even lower setting, and it's kind of aimed upwards, you know, from an upwards angle, and has, again, just a little bit of a tinge of yellow. Nothing too crazy, as I still want things to kind of read in a very neutral lighting setting. Course, just add a camera, and then we just pilot the camera, make sure we bake the level, hit G to go into game mode, and then take our high resolution screenshot. And then, of course, we can just incorporate that into our overall portfolio, just have a nicer full range breakdown sheet. When it comes to getting your environment work or any kind of artwork out in front of a lot of people, one of the big stumbling blocks I see throughout a lot of students and even professionals is creating consistent and clear reading portfolio layout pages. It's something that, you know, it seems kind of simple that you would want something nice, clean, concise, has all the information you need on there, and yet many people just kind of forget this, and they just kind of leave a screenshot, and they'll just, maybe put their name on it, maybe they'll put their project on it, or sometimes they'll just leave it up on ArtStation like this. You've got this nice image, it's great to look at, but it gives you no information of who the artist was. If you're on like someone's website or you send this image around, you're like, all right, well, who made this piece of art? Where can I find more of their artwork? What exactly is this project? And that's something you want to be very aware of when you're creating your portfolio work, is you want to make sure your name and also your website are clearly marked on your portfolio layout sheets. It's the easiest way for someone who sees your artwork to be able to find who you are, and potentially it could lead to a possible job. So one of the things I like to do is I like to have my name in one corner and my website in the opposite corner. And I keep those extremely consistent. On any one of my layouts, no matter where it is, those two are always the same. And if someone saves off a bunch of the images off my website or my ArtStation and they're just flipping through them, my name and my website are always shown there. They're always in the same place. And so it's always kind of just stuck in their mind. And it kind of gets burned into their memory. And they just kind of start to subconsciously remember it. Now, what I have down here is I generally like to have whatever my project is. If it's either for a game, I'm going to put Uncharted 4 here and the little logo, just so kind of showing off the fact that this is from an actual game. It is production quality artwork. But if it is something that is, more of a personal project, I'll just leave whatever kind of name I'm giving the project to kind of give it a bit more weight and make it feel like it's a more enveloped and developed project than just some random personal art. And then, of course, I have the studio name, working at Naughty Dog. I put the logo of the studio there. And if I was to be working on a personal project, what I would generally do is whatever kind of engine or tools or software I use to create this art, I would just add the little logos down here. Like I would add the Unreal logo, potentially the, Substance logo, 3ds Max or Maya logo, ZBrush, whatever you use to kind of create your art project. So it just kind of shows off everyone who's looking at it, and they can instantly see like, oh, okay, this is, Anthony Vaccaro's artwork. It's the project that he was working on, whatever it is, if it's, a full-fledged game or just some personal artwork, the either company he worked at for it or the software he used. And you're like, oh, he made this in Unreal. He used Substance to create the textures and Photoshop and sculpted some things in ZBrush. And then, of course, I have my website. Now, it doesn't need to be your actual personal website if you don't have one. You could also use your ArtStation, any way for just people to easily get in contact with you without having to jump through a lot of hoops. Now, another key I like to add is kind of this border just around the pages. I feel it nicely frames things, and it just kind of helps centralize and focus the viewer into the kind of centralized art here. And, of course, being an artist and everything, I added a little bit of grunge effect to the sides, but that's completely unnecessary. It's not really needed. You want to keep anything like that to a very bare minimum. But it was just something I added one time, and I just kind of kept with it and have made it a consistent theme throughout all of my layout sheets. So anything that's kind of done, any kind of the images that you'll see, they're always going to just have just the same kind of, nice border. So it's just very consistent. You don't have to, of course, go with a full-fledged border. Even having just a nice little line down at the bottom easily frames and kind of just docks your entire website page and information. You could also easily put it up at the top or on the side. Now, these are just kind of some of the tips that, will help you propel your art and keep it in a more stable fashion and help it avoid getting lost in the shuffle. A lot of times when, an artist finds someone's work who they really like and they're like, oh, this is really cool, I'm gonna just email it around work. They start emailing out images. And if your image is just this and they're like, look at this dude's artwork, this is really cool. And maybe the name of whoever it did got lost in the shuffle, lost in one of the emails, it got saved to some directory, and someone finds it, they're like, who is this guy? Who made this artwork? And you're like, well, I actually don't know, because there's no information on there. There's no way for me to find out who this is, how to get in contact with them, and potentially offer them a job. And this is actually a real thing that happens. And I've seen it many times at Naughty Dog where pieces of artwork get, sent around from, things that are seen on Polycount, on ArtStation, on Twitter. And you're like, oh, this person's great. I want to see more of their work. We're looking for texture artists. Let's try and get them in for an interview. And then you're like, well, I don't have any of their information. I can't really find where they're from, what this project was, what their name is. So keeping those things very consistent and kind of there in your face so you can easily see it and easily find your work is something you want to keep in mind and keep very consistent. And not only that, but once you create your layout for your kind of horizontal kind of website, it's also good to make one for a vertical sized layout presentation as well. Generally, when you're doing an environment art piece, you're not going to keep a kind of horizontal style layout, but it's always good to have one that is very consistent. The same can go for a kind of square layout. So this is something I did for like my ArtStation thumbnails, and you can see that like each one of these is very consistent. They're all the same throughout. They all kind of have the main name of the project that I worked on, as well as the studio, just kind of at the bottom, and the top is just the name with the artwork in the middle. And it's a good way to kind of keep things very consistent. And any project I work on, I consistently do this, so I have a same kind of theming throughout. You want to do this on, square images for either ArtStation thumbnails or even Instagram, if you're going to use Instagram for your kind of extra portfolio. And the same goes for your horizontal layouts as well. So just keep things in mind, as it'll make your work more visible and easier for people to get in contact with you if they want to. Now we've come to the point where we've taken our high-res screenshots, we've established how to make a layout and the important information we want to put on it, and now we come to the point where we need to decide what are we actually going to include in our portfolio from all the high-res screenshots we've taken. So right now here I have just a Photoshop layer that's sized appropriately for kind of the web. Even these are still kind of large images, but they're not anything like some 4K massive image that's going to take the internet forever to load. So they're an appropriate size. They have a nice little banner here to just kind of cut off things and display any information I want to show in this image off really well. Of course, I have my name, CG Master Academy, of course, their little logo, the programs that were used to build this scene, which is Maya, ZBrush, Substance, Photoshop, and Unreal, and of course, my website. Now, if you want, you can just put ArtStation / whatever your username is. Mine is Autocon, so I could easily do that as well. But we've come to the point where we want to trim down and figure out what's going to work best for our online portfolio. Now, again, less is kind of more, and you want to definitely keep things under really 10 images. 10 images seem to be kind of the max kind of threshold for any kind of single project. If you're making a game, you're showing off a vast array of different environments, then, that's cool to go over that. But we want to try and pare things down so we only really have a few images to show off our best work. And so I'm going to quickly go over some kind of ideas and thoughts that I had on just my own screenshots that I took to kind of give you an idea of what you can do to kind of pare down your work. So one of the first images I have here is just kind of an overall kind of composition of the scene. It's got a nice focal point area here in the lower 2/3 of the screen. It's kind of in that nice 3/4 aspect ratio. It's right there. We also have some other kind of key elements. We have this little waterfall up here. We have it showing we're in a vast scene, kind of giving this nice sense of scale. We've got, some nice clumping of colors just little sprinkled in here. Even our assets are kind of nicely clumped, where we have this like little patch of grass. It becomes its own kind of clump here. These stones over here, these trees here, trees over here, and then these trees over here as well. So they all kind of create some nice clumping atmosphere there, so things aren't too noisy and busy in a generally otherwise kind of busy environment with a lot going on. So it gives you a lot to kind of digest, and it makes you want to review the image multiple times. It's trying to draw you in, with these focal points, with these kind of clumpings. You're like, oh, okay, I see there's a clumping of green here, cool, whatever. But on your second kind of read through, you're like, oh, there's some little ferns and smaller little bushes, some rocks, some little colorful flowers. And so this is all helping draw the viewer into your scene a bit more than just if they were like, oh, one quick read and then they're done. So one of the other images I have, of course, is my just kind of overall prop sheet. It's just got a bunch of the assets that were used to kind of build up the scene. Got large cliff, a medium-sized boulder, some smaller rocks in here, these teepees, some fallen trees, some dead trees, some living trees, and then a bunch of different foliage. So these are great to show a breakdown of how your scene was built. So maybe those are two images that were like, okay, these are pretty good. Now I've got this more slightly cinematic feel with these kind of like bars on here. It's not necessary to do that, but it kind of really focused in this shot. And I believe we went over that earlier when we were setting up the camera. And so I really like this image as it's got a very different vibe than, our previous image. It's got a different kind of post-processing tonality to it. It's a little bit cooler, a bit bluer. It's got that ice. The ice really pops. It's definitely down here in the foreground. It draws you in with those reflections. And, you have these little moments of, what's beyond these tree lines. There's a little gap here that like just drawing the eye towards this area, and you want to explore more in the environment. But these kind of vertical shapes just all keep you barred in, and it keeps you drawn back into the focal plane of the ice and this little frozen pond. Next, I have kind of a more reverse shot, and one that's added, some really nice volumetric fog. It just shows off, how dynamic this environment can be with just some lighting changes and some really just some quick fog changes in here. It gives a really nice moody feel that I want to portray to the viewer. And it's showing off some of the snow and just trees, and it's very simple, but it's drawing you once again into the image. It's creating this nice little contrasty patch right here that's drawing you. You're like, what's beyond these trees? I can tell that there's more there. I can see these fog lines, just cutting through the trees, slicing through it, and it's like, what's there? I want to explore more. Next, we have, kind of a large overall kind of canyon feel. It's got this really nice wraparound effect here that's just, again, drawing the eye to lead you through the image and kind of just go through it and be like getting a nice swooping motion with your eyes, or just kind of like following it along. And you're like, oh, okay, this is interesting. The same could be true if you read the image, from this way. It's bringing you along with all these shapes. They're kind of just pulling you down and then pulling you to, some of the rocks in the water that make an interesting kind of feeling of just rocky rapids going, some little bushes growing in the kind of like little spaces between all these rocks. And of course, again, we want to keep, clumping our assets into areas so we don't have too much noise all over the place. So we have little areas here that are nice and green, and we don't just have it everywhere. It's not like all over here and not over here and here. We've got a nice little patch here, a nice little patch here, as well as some trees that are just like nestled right here, and nothing too crazy around here to just keep the scene competing against each other and fighting too much. Now we have another one here that's just this kind of like really kind of quaint little rolling hill. It's showing off some of the really nice kind of subsurface and opacity that's generated from a lot of this foliage. It becomes really light. It's really a friendly scene, very much like the Lord of the Rings that we discussed about. It's got a much warmer vibe to it. There's nothing really kind of too much about this scene. There's not a lot going on. It's a very simple, tranquil scene, and that's kind of what I was going for. And of course, you can see the snow kind of lumped in through here. The sun is hitting off it, showing off some of those specular responses, and it's just, a very nice, quaint scene. Here we have, kind of a more pulled back shot. It's got some of the interest here in the kind of mid-ground. We've got some foreground elements in here with these rocks and these weeds just going along with this river. It's trying to pull you through the image, kind of leading you back here of like, oh, I see some cliffs back here, what's kind of around the bend as well. Again, you just want to compose these scenes so that you're trying to draw the viewer into these spaces. Again, with these trees on this hillside, it's again pointing towards here, which this little negative space, which is trying to create, again, more of a feeling of being pulled into the image, wanting to see what's in there. Again, our teepees also line up in that same kind of arcing pattern, as well as our cliffs over here and our rock here. It's all just kind of nicely pointing to where we want the viewer to, or the player to eventually go to. Now here we have a kind of far away shot again of our scene. Again, kind of here in our three, in our equally divided up scene, we've got our focal point over here. It's kind of drawing you there, but we have some, varied interests. It's not just the same far away shot as our original one was. It's a much different angle and take on it. We've got a lot more going on here. We've got, you can see this canyon that's kind of flowing through there. You can see that it goes back, and there's definitely more back there. Again, just trying to give that idea of you want to explore. We've got these kind of trees, and some of them are fallen. They're all dead around this side, where it feels like we're up kind of in these snowy cliffs and up on these peaks. So it just gives a nice different feel to the space. Here, of course, we have our shot that is a nice little close-up of our teepees. This kind of one here in the foreground. It's getting a bit of depth of field out, which is nice. We've got this kind of subsurface scattering going on. We can see the light inside the teepee kind of pouring out, gives a lot of nice visual interest there. We have our mid-ground, teepees here, as well as our big, large cliff here that stands very imposing out here in the background. Now we're getting to the point where it's like, okay, I've decided I've liked a lot of the images that are shown, but that's already 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 images that I was like, all right, these are pretty good. I like them, and I probably want to use them. And so now I've got just a few more here that I'm like, okay, well, I've got 5 left, and I really need to decide, what I kind of want to go with. Now I like this image here. It's got a lot of nice kind of clumping going on. You've got this really nice large clump of greenery here. This dirt path is, its own separating entity. It's got some nice blend work here between the spaces so they don't just feel very jarring. And then of course it has this nice clump again here of this snow. So it reads as 3 really different materials, and it's really nice. And it's got this kind of road that's again leading us. However, one of the issues with this image potentially can be that this tree right here is creating this very vertical line, and it's really kind of harsh, and it's essentially just stopping the viewer's eye from just kind of following this trail along here. It just kind of hits this tree and just would want to stop. And not only that, there's really nothing very visually interesting beyond this path, beyond the fact that you're kind of like, oh, what's around the bend? There's nothing drawing you further in towards the image. So maybe if I remove this image and created something back here in this area that would help draw me further in and want to explore more of the space instead of just, a row of trees. So that is one thing to keep in mind. For this image, it's kind of another canyon shot. It's a little bit higher up. It's showing off the larger kind of cliffs, which are essentially just a duplicate of the cliff that I made that are in kind of more of the foreground with just, a less noisy and busy kind of texture. It's very simplified so that when they're very far away, they kind of read a little better. And so this is, a nice one showing all these trees on these cliffs. However, we already have kind of a cliff canyon scene. So although I might like this image, this was one that could easily stand to be kind of cut out of the kind of final 10 shots that you want to gather. And remember, even with your 10 shots, you still have your layout sheet as one of them. So you really have like 9 that you kind of want to play with. Here we have another one that's kind of a far away pulled back shot of our little lake here. It's not as dramatic and kind of intense as, our original one here. And although it does show a lot more of the environment, it's not as visually interesting. So that one, although, might be good to show off a lot of the environment, you might want to kind of tone it down and kind of cut this one out as well. Now I like this image here as it's got a nice sense of weight to the left side here with all these rocks. It's got a clumping of green right here in the middle, and these trees kind of help keep the viewer from falling out of the image since it is so vertically and left heavy. Your eye just wants to kind of follow along, but then these trees kind of just stop it with their very vertical nature and kind of keep you back into the image. The issue with this image that I found is that although I do enjoy it, it is pretty dark. And when you're thinking about these images, you want to have that, again, nice play of light and shadow. And with this all being really kind of in shadow, except the area just right over here on the very bleeding edge of this scene, it feels a little more flat, a little less dynamic. So maybe if I change the sun angle, get some more kind of light, maybe trappling over, some of these rocks and trees and still keeping this kind of area right here in shadow. Maybe that might make for a more compelling image that I'd want to use. Otherwise, it might be one that could stand the chopping block. And then finally, we have this image right here. Of course, it is a very dynamic, image with these like lens flares, going off on this tree, the sun being right behind it. It's showing off our snow mounds really well. Got the little hints of speck. It looks like, the light is kind of pouring through the snow with the subsurface scattering. It's a pretty compelling and interesting image. However, it's not really showing off too much of our overall environment beyond just some of these little trees and of course snow. And this light, of course, takes up a lot of it. So this might be one that, although it looks really nice, you might want to show off to people, it might be one you might want to kind of cut back on in favor of something, more with, again, still having dramatic lighting, but being more in tune with showing off a larger scale of the environment and showing off a bit more of the kind of, storytelling and drawing the eye into these spaces. So that's just a few of the tips I have for kind of trying to figure out what images you want to kind of pare down and figure out which ones you want to kind of include. I went through, got my top 9 that I really liked, and I saved those off for my portfolio. And some of these kind of later shots down here were all kind of like, okay, they could easily hit the chopping block and, definitely can stand to lose them, as we just don't want to overwhelm people with having too many images and then them just being like, oh, okay, well, I'm just going to move on. I've seen, the first 5 images. I'm not going to look at the rest. So even when you're trying to think of these things, try and even think of whatever your top 5 are, such as, maybe this cliff section canyon here, this little foggy kind of scene here, this guy right here, our overall shot, and then maybe even, our nice little hillside. So those would be essentially my top 5. And if you're ever like writing an article, generally they don't want more than 4 or 5 images. So those could be your best 5. And if you compare it down to there, you might even just cut your portfolio off there if you don't want to show, kind of redundancies in just a lot of these kind of areas. So those are things to just keep in mind when trying to create your portfolio. Once you have all of your portfolio sheets ready to go and you're ready to start building your website, there's really no better option, not only in terms of price and accessibility, as ArtStation. It's a great way to quickly and easily get your art portfolio up online in a really clean, nice format. Here I have mine with just a bunch of the kind of work I've done over the years for like Hey the Reach, Uncharted 3, Uncharted 4, and even The Lost Legacy, and even just a few of kind of the personal projects I worked on as well. It's a really clean website. Everything is really kind of nicely standardized, and this is just the free model itself. I highly recommend upgrading to the pro version of ArtStation, as it gives you a lot more flexibility. You get a lot of really nice themes that you can choose from. There are some really great horizontal themes which can really help show off an environment art portfolio a little bit better. There are ones that are great for characters, concept art, even just a better looking kind of square portfolio. And it's, not too expensive, just $72 a year. As soon as my website kind of domain runs out, I'll of course be upgrading to it as well. But unfortunately, right before the pro version came out, I spent way too much time creating my own website, and then I had to pay a whole bunch of money to keep it online for 2 years. So highly recommend ArtStation. It's a way simpler way to go, way cheaper. You get this really nice layout. You don't have to like learn how to code and try and figure all these things out. I spent probably 3 weeks just trying to get, a handle on HTML and figuring out. Big waste of time. Highly recommend just going the easy way. Unless you are kind of someone who already knows HTML and you want to program your own website, ArtStation is really the way to go. Anytime we're sending around portfolios or looking at them, we're almost always using ArtStation. Everyone's like, cool, just send me their ArtStation. And, that's kind of how we do our kind of art review process of anyone who's applying. It's really simple. You just have all these nice little thumbnails. Again, keeping things consistent. Each one of these nice little thumbnails is very consistent. The upper row clearly, designates what's the name of the game. I have obviously the studio, and it's kind of throughout each kind of project. And the personal art ones, I just don't really have anything for that. I could go in there and make my own kind of personal logo for each of them. So that's one thing to think about. Now, when you are trying to get more visibility and more people viewing your portfolio, you're going to want to think about how much you are actually showing in each kind of little breakdown here. And that's kind of one of the big keys, and something that I see a lot of people kind of miss the mark on. And I'm not gonna lie, I even missed the mark on it many times. And that's the issue of putting too much artwork in any one kind of like folder. You click on it and there's 30 things, 30 different images, and you're like, this is too many. And when someone is like looking at your artwork, they're gonna click on any one scene and they're gonna start to scroll and they'll be like, okay, have I gotten the idea of what they were doing? And they're like, cool. And eventually they'll get to a point where they're like, all right, I've seen enough. I don't want to keep scrolling anymore. I'm going to go look at the next scene. And if they get to a point where they're like, all right, this was a good amount. I understand what they were going for in this environment. I can see some of the breakdowns. It didn't take too long. Those are the best kind of ways to go about building your portfolio. It's kind of a less is more. You understand what to kind of cut out from your environment portfolio. And that's a big key that I think a lot of people just really miss the mark on. They just want to show a million different screenshots and a million different views, and that's not the way to go about it. You have to treat your portfolio much like any of your art as well. You have to figure out and understand what is your best artwork and what is, the weaker shots. And you want to cut out all the weak art you possibly can. As anyone who's looking at kind of portfolios, reviewing them, I want to just see your best art. And generally that can be like between 5 to 10 screenshots in any one of these like little things that you click on. You're like, okay, this is a different environment area. It's a jungly kind of thing. I get the feeling for it. I'm not scrolling forever. I get a little breakdown. You're like, okay, I understand what this is. Now, to show a contrasting different example, here for the Western Ghats in Uncharted: The Lost Legacy, it was a very large hub, and I just kind of put everything into one big section. It was all one, kind of similar environment. So I just kind of put everything in there as it was all the same environment. I was like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna put everything in there. And I wasn't really thinking about, oh, this is gonna start to get to the point where someone's gonna look at this and they're gonna be scrolling, and they're gonna be scrolling, and they're gonna keep scrolling. And if you can see, I'm only halfway down. I haven't even gotten through all these pieces of art. Now, that's a little too many pieces in there. It's just gonna be like, okay, they might be different sections, they might be different looks, but I'm scrolling a lot and I don't feel like I'm getting a nice change and a different pace. And you wanna be able to do that. You wanna be like, okay, do I really need this image here? I might personally like it myself, but is it, kind of compelling and showing why I have, artistic skills or, the necessary ability to do the job that I'm ideally applying for. So, maybe this is one that I would want to cut out. And, same with a few of these other ones. I've got a, pretty wide shot here, but then I've got this other wide shot as well. Maybe I could just get rid of this one and, stick with this as my wide overall shot. So paring down your portfolio is something you really want to take into account. Even if you were to go in here and like split some of these areas up so you just don't have to be scrolling and scrolling. As you can see, I'm still scrolling. So clearly, even professionals can still miss the mark on when creating your portfolio. And you're like, okay, that was way too many pieces of art for any one little thing. Figuring out what is your best quality work, putting just, 5 to 10 images, really kind of max in there, is the best way to go about kind of creating any one of these little environments. And I highly recommend showing any kind of small little breakdown, even if it's not too big. It's just showing the assets that you've made and what makes up this environment so they can understand that you created these things and how you went about doing it and what your kind of thought process was for it. So for this kind of reef scene that I did here, I've got some, half of underwater shots. I've got one that's fully underwater, another one that's showing just mainly all this coral, one that's kind of above. So I'm getting a lot of different variation in there. And then I have just, a few breakdown shots. I've got one of this coral types right here, the kind of, just wireframe, as well as just these shaded views. Another one showing a bunch of different other types of coral, some rock sculpts that I did and just like their meshes. And then, the boat and kind of an environment composed scene with the wireframe. And that will just give employers the ability to kind of look at your artwork and see like, okay, how is he building this? Or how is she building this? How are they kind of deconstructing these assets and assembling them into a scene? Where are they putting all their detail? Are they focusing it in the right areas? Or are they wasting a whole bunch of geometry on a bunch of unnecessary things and just adding a bunch of noise all over the place? So adding in these breakdowns is a great way to just kind of give a better view of kind of the art assets you've made. If you are going to go the route of actually building your own website and you don't want to use ArtStation, or you don't want to upgrade to kind of like ArtStation Pro, when you are creating it, here are some more tips that could help you out. Now, I find the ArtStation layout to be, a great one, so I kind of modeled my portfolio off that before ArtStation really had the ArtStation Pro. So again, I have, each of the title projects of the things I worked on, some, clear, consistent images, a nice even kind of flow throughout. And, when you click on them, you get a little blurb about what they are. They have the images and even some breakdown shots as well. Some wireframes, some texture shots. These are just ways you want to go about doing this, and there's not too much. You can also add in these cool little things like Sketchfab models, and you can load them up. So you can load in your model and kind of the viewer can just kind of rotate around it, check it out. They can look at a bunch of the different kind of like attributes like the wireframe or, different kind of texture levels, diffuse, specular, all that kind of stuff. You can even do this on ArtStation. And it's just a great way for people to be more invested in your art. When they can move it around and they can essentially get this kind of more tactile feedback and ability to play with it, they're going to be more invested and they want to like play around with it, and they'll stay on your page longer. Now, you can also add, a nice clean resume that has everything you did. You want to mirror anything that has in a PDF Word document. If you are creating your website yourself, a really beneficial thing is to add a zip file that will allow the kind of person to download all the images, resumes, kind of PDF files of your entire website. So I found this to be extremely helpful, and I know a lot of people utilize it when they have it on a portfolio of someone they are interested in hiring. So it's a great way to go about doing things. But you want to keep your portfolio simple, stick to kind of that ArtStation model. It is a great way to go about doing it. When trying to figure out different ways to kind of present your artwork, there's a bunch of different artists throughout ArtStation that you can look at and kind of steal their ideas on how they're presenting things to show off and demo off your artwork in the best possible way. Now, Daniel here is an environment artist at Bungie and possibly one of the most talented substance artists that I've personally ever seen. I think his work is just absolutely staggeringly amazing. Completely in love with it. You should definitely check out his stuff. It's just super inspiring. But you can see his portfolio is just all these substance kind of shader balls. They're all extremely consistent. He does the exact same kind of, framing of things. These are all the things he worked on for Destiny 2. These are things that he sells on Gumroad. So it's really nice, really clean, very consistent. And, having that kind of consistent theming is just going to make your overall portfolio much more eye appealing and, just something that you want to view and just take a look at. And if we take a look at some of, just his breakdowns, we can see just like how gorgeous some of these substances are. They look fantastic. It's definitely not going to look like this in a game engine. It's overly tessellated. Pretty sure this is just rendered out of Substance, but it looks fantastic. It shows off the high quality of artwork that he can do. We have the classic Substance shader spheres, which are a great way to, highlight your substance work, your artistic ability to create really great looking substances, even if it's not something that will, look like in a game like this for maybe 5-10 years. It's a great way to just show off your artwork. Now, if you'll notice, there is one issue in Daniel's work. There's no contact information. There's no name, there's no website, there's none of that. If I saved this off and saved it to my desktop randomly, there's a really good chance that his name and, who he is, where he works, what, this was for, is just instantly going to get lost. And I would have no idea how to find him and find more of his artwork. So you can see even really talented, really professional people can easily make that mistake of not including their name and, some useful contact information. There's, other ways to kind of create different shader kind of substance works. Jared, a texture artist at Naughty Dog, did, these really nice kind of cylinder ones. It's a little bit different than a sphere, so, it kind of puts things in a different perspective. they don't all just have that kind of sphere look that you definitely see around ArtStation quite a lot. So it kind of separates his stuff from, a few others as well. You can see he also has just, flat texture breakdowns, base color, height maps, roughness, normal maps. We also just have, some bricks. And then another thing I really like that he did is, one thing you don't see with some of the stuff like Daniel's work is generally you'll see just one substance and that's it. And although those are great, the real question is, how are they going to blend with other textures? He kind of almost has that here where he has this different variation of it, but they're not really blending together. It's got this line in the middle and it's just two different renders. And what I really like about Jared's work is he's showing what his original brick kind of substance was, and then how he is kind of blending it to more broken brick. And this is what it would look like if you were blending in game. It's something that I feel like is just constantly missed in anytime someone is showing off their kind of shader work, and seeing even just a single plane with two different materials that you have blending together like we've done in Unreal with some vertex painting, I think will really go a long way and showcase your ability to take your own artwork and actually show how it blends together, how it will look in game. And that's extremely beneficial for any lead or, art director who's looking at your portfolio and trying to figure out if you're someone who can not just make a, really pretty brick texture, but someone who can actually understand that you want to be blending these, multiple textures together. You want to be height blending them for, the best consistent look. Again, he has some nice just texture sheet breakdowns, and then some others that have tint and color variations, showing off the kind of power and usability of his shaders. It's not just this one, kind of metal plating that he has made. He's got different ones with different paint variations, and it just showcases the kind of power and diversity of his own shaders. So these are all things to keep in mind. But again, even Jared definitely made the mistake of not putting his name on there. He got the project and the studio, which is definitely beneficial. But again, he's missing his name and his contact information. So if I save this off, I might not know who did it. And that's always a shame. You want your name and your easy contact information to be always up front. But definitely just go through ArtStation, check around, look at other people's portfolios, look how they made them, how they set them up, what kind of consistent theming they have. And you can easily find different ways to just kind of style your own portfolio sheets based off what other artists have done. It's a great way just to get some ideas and inspiration. Congratulations, you've made it to the end of organic world building. But before we kind of say our final goodbyes and our closing thoughts, let's take a quick recap of what we learned this week in our final. So we took a look at color grading that we discussed before in the previous week with some examples, and this time we learned how to actually create a lookup table in Photoshop and import it into Unreal, and how it can give us a lot of flexibility of just being able to really kind of change all the post-processing settings that we want in Photoshop and then have Unreal do a lot of the heavy lifting. We took a look at tessellation. We saw how we can add some just quick and dirty basic tessellation to any object, but then also how we can use more advanced tessellation added to our landscape, have a lot of control of how far things tessellate out, and even using that advanced kind of setup, putting that on our regular assets to kind of get a lot of extra depth and dimension to our scene. Now again, tessellation is really expensive. Your computer might not be able to handle it, so definitely be careful with that, and be aware that it's really not something that's widely used in games at all. It's used in a few areas, on PC builds where they do have the horsepower, they do have their graphics cards to support that, but in general, you're not going to have tessellation just all over your ground, all over your assets. So you really want to make sure your assets look great without tessellation, but for these kind of portfolio shots, it makes them look really fantastic and really stand kind of a cut above the rest. So it is something you might want to add to your scene. We also took a look at depth of field and how we can add that just onto the camera so we can really kind of play around with our shots instead of trying to fiddle around with it in just a post-processing volume. We saw the kind of differences of depth of field and how circle is really kind of the standard that a lot of people use. It's not adding any kind of crazy depth of field that you get either from the kind of faked Gaussian blur or, the really expensive bokeh, which you're going to need a lot of kind of camera knowledge to really understand everything that's happening there. So you want to kind of stick with circle, get just some minor depth of field in there. You don't want to go too crazy, as you don't want to blur out your scenes that you're kind of creating here. Because again, if you're adding too many post-processing effects like camera depth of field or a chromatic aberration, people are just going to assume you're trying to hide kind of things that are wrong in your scene. We also took a look at actually just setting up the Unreal camera and how we can pilot the camera around, set up and establish some really nice shots, and we can just go through and kind of utilize whether we want to have a smaller or wider kind of field of view to get some really cinematic feeling in our shots. We also took a look at composing our scenes and things to keep in mind when composing them, and kind of trying to hit that golden ratio and keeping things into these 3/4 quadrants. That way you'll just have a more dynamic scene, and the eye just tends to kind of follow to those points. So we looked at how we can compose our scenes to create interesting areas and things that the viewer might not have seen before. We also took a look at how we can render out high-res screenshots that we'll then use for our portfolios. We'll want to take a bunch of different screenshots and then eventually pare them down in our kind of last step once are ready to really kind of create our layout sheets and upload these online. Then we took a kind of deep dive into portfolios and all the things that can help or hurt them, and what you want to do as an environment artist to best show off your work. We took a look at layout sheets and how it's funny how it's such a simple thing that's most often overlooked. Many people don't include the important information that you want anyone who saves your image to always have, such as your name and your website, where they can find you. So these are kind of key things. You want to keep your layouts simple. You don't want to be overly graphic with them. Having some bit of kind of character and style is definitely fine, but highlighting, your name and your website are the two most important things. And of course, including the kind of software and tools that you use on there is definitely beneficial for anyone viewing it and wanting to know how you went about making this scene. We then went over how to kind of choose and pick your best work. Now, this is a really key and important step that many people just don't do. They just upload all the screenshots that they took and they're like, look at all this amazing work I did. And then you realize, okay, I've been scrolling for about an hour now on all of your work, and I really kind of stopped looking at image number 5 or 6. So you want to kind of really pare down your work, find the best 5 to 10 images throughout your scene and show that you know how to kind of cut out the fat, and just show me and the viewer what is most important. What are your absolute best work? As again, you're only as strong as your weakest piece. So cut out the filler, cut out the fat. We then took a look at why ArtStation is a fantastic place to upload your portfolio to. It's really kind of the go-to place now for creating a website and a portfolio. You don't really need to learn a bunch of HTML or Dreamweaver, or even kind of pay a whole bunch of money to just then have to still build your own website. I went through kind of the flaws with that and how I made my own website, and as soon as the kind of recurring payments end, I'm definitely going to be switching to the ArtStation Pro model, as it is really simple, it's really clean, they keep everything really up to date, and it's a really just great way to do it. And even your most basic free ArtStation is what most employers are looking at when passing around people's portfolio. They're like, oh cool, I want to see your work, what's your ArtStation? So ArtStation is the way to go, and just remember, keep things really nice, really simple, and keep a very cohesive kind of look throughout all of not only your layout sheets, but also your ArtStation thumbnails. It'll really give this really nice look and feel to your work that feels like you purposely made all those decisions, instead of just haphazardly throwing it together and throwing it online. Now that each of you have made it through the 10-week organic world building class, I wanted to go over some kind of closing thoughts that just kind of help sum up the class, and some things to just remember in case you forgot them throughout, the 10 weeks of lessons and all the learning that you have surely done. When establishing an environment, creating a good blueprint foundation is kind of the key and will really help you build a much better world and a much better environment. Planning things out, although might not be the most fun, is definitely going to set you off on a better footing. I do it all the time at work, and it really helps speed up my process of building an environment instead of just kind of being like, what am I going to make? I don't know. I'm going to make a tree or a rock. And then you're like, oh, actually, I totally was going to make something, a totally different style of rock, totally different type of tree, totally new layout. So establishing a good blueprint is the kind of foundation for success. Create high quality assets and reuse if possible. Now, when you're going throughout any of your scenes and any other, project, you want to create really high quality assets. It's better to have, a handful of really high quality assets than a whole bunch of assets that are just really subpar and not working well for your scene. You want to create assets that are indicative of the quality of work you can actually achieve. And if you can, much like in any kind of production environment where we are reusing assets from scene to scene and even from project to project, reuse assets if you have them up to a high quality standard. You don't really need to remake the same clump of grass or the same kind of, fern or bush. If you already have one that's really high quality, it'll allow you to focus in on creating new assets that you don't have that can help just expand your library of assets to help build your environment. As an environment really kind of sells itself on just the diversity it has in it. Keep the key concept of primary, secondary, and tertiary in mind when not only creating assets, but also your environment. We want to have that nice flow of large shapes to medium shapes to kind of smaller shapes. It gives a nice gradient blend, and you don't just have harsh transitions where you have a large rock sticking into ground and nothing to kind of like blend it off or give any kind of story elements of like, all right, well, we have this big cliff, but normally on real cliffs in real life, large boulders kind of break away, and then from those large boulders, even smaller little stones chip away. So just think about that, keep that in mind. It can fit for anything, not just even organic environments, but also man-made environments. If you have a building, you're not just going to have the building and it's going to end. You're going to have, secondary shapes such as maybe a bus stop or little awnings or, kind of phone booths, things to kind of help bleed the building down into the ground and environment and help ground it and secure it in the world. And of course, your tertiary shapes could easily be some debris or boxes or trash cans or anything like that. So again, keep those things in mind. They work for any kind of environment. Lead the player or the viewer from one point of an interest to the next. Now, this is a key when trying to lead a player through an environment and you want to create a really strong environment, is having the ability to direct the player without necessarily needing a road itself to the next kind of objective that they need to go to. Being an environment artist is key to kind of leading the player through a gameplay space. And you're going to want to work with your designers to kind of establish ways that you can help draw the player either around a corner or, over a hill or down into a valley. What are the things that are really going to kind of draw them there? What kind of things are you going to use to highlight? Are you going to use color? Are you going to use shape? Are you going to use negative space to kind of draw them into those areas? It helps lead them where they need to go, and they feel like, although they're exploring this, organic environment themselves, they don't really feel that they're being, pulled along. It's not necessarily a road itself, a literal road, but they're still being drawn there. And so they get this sense of exploration without really exploring anything because you, the artist, is helping draw them along. Create implied lines with rocks, trails, rivers, tree lines, and clumps of foliage. So this definitely ties in with leading the player from one point of interest to the next. That is more of the kind of carrot on a stick approach of what's over the next bend? What's the next cool thing I want to keep seeing the next cool point of interest. And you can easily do that by creating these implied lines that will help funnel the player with, rocks that all kind of angle in a certain way, trails that are either kind of dirt trails or even just kind of animal trails or trails of different types of foliage and different types of colors. They can all help lead you through a space quite easily, and it just gives a sense of nice direction and flow to your environment. Environmental storytelling. Now, once you're done kind of creating your environment, you're not going to really add all these little scratches to things like you would a normal kind of prop, scratches or fingerprints or wears. So you want to be able to tell a story with your environment. Once you've got all the main foundations set up, how are you going to differentiate your environment from everyone else? What are you going to do to set it apart? And environmental storytelling can be done in a number of different ways. You can play with organic shapes and the environment. Maybe there's a large kind of cliff falling, kind of some rubble fell and it's created a nice little chasm, just all these large stones, they've all built up and you're like, oh, there was clearly like a landslide. Maybe you added some trees in there, some are still like have all the branches on them, all the green leaves. So you're like, oh, okay, this landslide clearly happened recently. Another example could be maybe you have some water markings along a rock and you're like, oh, okay, these are kind of flood markings. This river here that's flowing through this area like occasionally floods and will leave water and sediment along a given height. And you can tell like when you're walking through that environment, you're like, oh, so normally it floods here and this sediment line that I see on these rocks to the side is kind of the height that the water floods to when the river overflows. So these are all things you want to think about and just kind of add in at the very end of your scene, as it'll really help set your scenes apart from anyone else who just kind of threw together some rocks and trees. Establish a balance of foreground, midground, and background in your screenshots. Now this is key to kind of creating dynamic and just multi-layered screenshots. Having something in the foreground, it could potentially either be, even if it's blurred out with depth of field or if it's kind of strong and, very crisp, it just kind of sets the viewing angle of where you are in the scene and makes your scene feel deeper and have more depth when you have foreground, midground, and then of course background in your screenshots. Prune your work and only keep the best. Again, we've kind of gone over this a few times, but you want to only showcase your best work. Again, you're only as strong as your worst work. So make sure you don't have too many images that the viewer is just like, or any, art director, lead artist that's looking at your work is like, I'm going to stop looking at this work. There's just too much of it. Keep your best work and just develop this habit of being able to prune some things that you might like and might want to show off, but you really only want to show off your absolute best. Put your name and website on your ArtStation portfolio layout sheets. This is kind of the biggest one. I can't stress it enough. I see it way too often. I've saved a bunch of work from people that I really liked, and then when I look back at it, or if I send it around at work to be like, hey, this person's really good, check out their work, and then you're like, well, whose work is this? And you're like, oh, I don't know. I don't remember. I didn't save it and then type their name in, when I saved the image. I just saved the image, or, you found the image on Pinterest or just random Google searches. So always just keep your name on your work. That way anyone can easily find you. They can easily just Google your name, or if you have your website, your ArtStation on there, they can easily just kind of be like, all right, bam, here we go. I've got your name, got all your info, and it's a great way to just kind of keep you found and understand where they can get more of your artwork. Now, the final kind of thought I have is, this is a 10-week course, and creating an environment generally is going to probably take longer than that. So if you didn't get everything done to the max quality that you wanted, don't worry about it. We just want to see what you can accomplish in 10 weeks. And on top of that, adding in all those extra little elements and those little story moments, those little character moments, those little polished details are what you're going to maybe want to go back to once you're done with this class. You're going to have a large breadth of knowledge now, and you can utilize things that might have taken you, a bit too long. You might not have been able to create the best looking rock sculpt. Maybe you're like, all right, well now I've done it once and I can go back and create a newer, better version of that and add it to my scene and just increase the quality of my portfolio. Same goes for kind of anything you do. Just because there's a deadline in any of your classes doesn't mean you can't just further add on to your scene and create a much better thing. Just because the class has ended doesn't mean this has to be your final portfolio work. Again, with the idea of you wanting to show your best work, if you need to spend, extra 2 or 3 weeks just adding to it and kind of adjusting your scene to be the absolute best quality work you can do, that's what you want to strive for. So don't fear if you didn't finish everything to the max quality that you feel like you can get your artwork to. Take any feedback, add it to your scene, just polish it up and make it the best quality work you can do. All right, that's kind of all the thoughts I've had for this class. I was super happy to be able to share it with you. I hope you guys all learned a lot. It was really fun teaching it, and I look forward to seeing all the work you've done over this kind of 10-week course and seeing the progress you made. That's something that always really excites me, is to see artists just kind of grow and be able to build out some really cool spaces. So again, thanks so much for taking the class. I really hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a lot. I know I definitely did, and I can't wait to see you guys in the Q&A. All right, good luck.